Do it.
Alrighty, so my name is Sam Anderson, and I'm here with my partners Gregorio Gonzalez and Irvin
Sure,
Hernandez
Gloria.
for Mr. Parsons' 50s and 60s course. We are interviewing Mrs. Judith Scott at 6 p.m. on May 9th, 2021 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin from our respective homes. Alrighty, so Nona, or I guess I have to call you Mrs. Scott.
You may call me Nona.
I'm
That
gonna
works
call you
just
Mrs.
fine.
Scott,
And,
for
and Urban and Gregorio can call me whatever they want. Or you can call me Judy.
Alrighty, Judy. So we understand that you grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and went to high school not far from downtown Tulsa. Can you paint us a picture of what Tulsa looked like in the early to late 50s? Like restaurants, notable businesses, and the overall vibe of the city at the time.
Tulsa was very much an oil town. It was an oil boom town and continued to do very well because they had a lot of headquarters of various oil companies there for a long time. And almost everybody they only had petroleum. There was not a lot of other industry there, but it was a booming petroleum, and a lot of petroleum companies that started there that made a lot of money. I think Tulsa was probably 250,000 people or so when I lived there. Tulsa had many areas of absolutely beautiful big homes with beautiful big manicured yards and so on. And it seemed growing up there like it was a great place, a nice size to grow up in. But if you've read your history, you know that Tulsa has a very terrible history. Have you done any research about the history of Tulsa?
Yeah, actually, I have that for a later question. But if you want, we can run through that right now. So I guess that question is, as I kind of see it, Tulsa, Oklahoma is a very southern city. What was segregation like back when you were growing up? And I know it's a bit before your time, but we talked about it a little bit. And I kind of would like you to explain a little bit about it and also how it was handled, the Tulsa Race Massacre.
The interesting thing about the Tulsa Race Massacre, which occurred 100 years ago, is that we never heard anything about it. I was never taught anything about it. It was never talked about. It was totally covered up. So I didn't learn about this until I was married. And I was shocked to find out that this worst, if not the worst, massacre of Black people in our country occurred in Tulsa in 1921. And it wiped out this Greenwood, which was a very thriving Black community. There were professionals who lived there who invited other professionals to come from different parts of the country. So they had, doctors, lawyers, lots of businesses and so on. And you can read about how terrible it was, but it was never rebuilt really after that. They tried to rebuild, but there were no reparations. They think that maybe as many as 300 people died. It was just a terrible occurrence. And it was interesting, once we found out about it, we learned from occasional friends that they knew about it because maybe there was a Black person who had done work for their family who came to them during this, and they sheltered them or took care of them during that period. So they had known about it, but most people, it was so covered up by the newspapers and all the history. So Tulsa, I did not consider Tulsa a deep South town. When I was growing up there, there were no signs for coloreds and whites, that sort of thing, this drinking fountain, whites only. But my sister reminded me that there were signs at every business. We reserve the right to refuse business to anyone for any reason. And that meant Black people. And so it was a very, very segregated community. Until my senior year, there were no Black people in any school that I went to, but at Central, when I was a senior, we had a couple of Black people, and that was the very beginning of the of integration at that point. So Tulsa was a good place to grow up in, but it had a very terrible history.
Yeah, I have no doubt about that. I did my own little research on the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I have yet to watch the documentary that came out for its 100th year anniversary. But yeah, by the way we were talking about it earlier and how you just spoke about it, it does seem like insane that you growing up in Tulsa only, a few decades after that, there was no word of this going around whatsoever.
It's amazing. And I think one of the reasons possibly was that the newspapers encouraged this whole massacre. They inflamed it. They basically sicked people to come out and participate. And I think, we learn a lot from the newspapers. Well, they never want to talk about this again because they were partly responsible for it. This is my own theory about it. And so it was just hushed up. And I think people were probably very, very ashamed, but they never did anything about it to make, as I say, any reparations. People did not have insurance. Insurance didn't pay because they said it was, their fault or whatever. So anyway, but that's enough about that. And in many ways, Tulsa as a kid was a lot of fun in terms of a place to grow up.
Yeah, I don't doubt that either. And on a little bit of a lighter note, as you were kind of talking about your experience in high school, Irvin has a few questions about some of the pictures you've shared with us as reference images. Irvin?
Yeah, as a reference image for this project, you provided us a picture of you in a poodle skirt. Can you describe to us the fashion choices of the time, and also what were some of your favorite fashion trends from over the years?
Well, I think the fashion thing is that if you looked at some of the pictures in the yearbook, you will see that girls always dressed up, and the guys not so much, but they wore jeans, t-shirts, kind of the usual stuff. But girls were always expected to wear skirts. There was no pants, slacks, jeans, allowed in school. Nobody thought about doing that. And hair, makeup, I didn't wear makeup, but people really made an effort to, girls made an effort to look good. I think there was a lot more pairing off of gals and guys in those days. Even in junior high, you went steady and somebody gave you their class ring and you put it around your neck. I mean, not me, because I somehow never got asked to go steady, but people paired off and went on dates in junior high and high school, which I think now it's assumed that everybody kind of goes in a group and people do things more in groups, but it was pretty much the norm that the boy would ask you out, and then after a while you were going steady. But the poodle skirts were a big thing. There were also these dresses we wore these crinoline petticoats, which really made the skirt stand out. In fact, I think like two people could get in a room at the same time because these skirts were so big. But the worst poodle skirt story was that my mother, who sewed a lot of our clothes, had sewed my sister and me this beautiful poodle skirt, made an elaborate design on it, which she had sewed on it and everything. And this was my sophomore year in high school. And I was not feeling very well one night, but I had a date, and we were double dating with my brother, and he had a date with somebody that he didn't, I think at that point wasn't all that excited about. We went to this dance, and I started to feel really sick. And I said, I don't feel very well. And I went to the bathroom and threw up. I never had a drink in high school, or maybe even college, or even now. So I wasn't drinking, I was just sick. But then I said, I think I feel okay. And so I went out and I was dancing and twirling around with my date, and then I just threw up all over him. And so my brother then said, well, I think we better take Judy home. And he took his date home because I think he was ready to end the evening with her. So it was really a disastrous night. And at that point, there was a television show called Wyatt Earp. And my last name was Wyant. And so naturally, Wyatt Earp became kind of the mantra of the night. But other than that, that poodle skirt was never worn again, which was very sad, I'm sure, for my mother and for my sister, who was supposed to be sharing it with me and never got to wear it, and has never quite forgiven me for that.
Yeah, what were some of your favorite fashion trends from over the years?
Oh, we had pedal pushers, which were, kind of 3/4 length pants that we could wear in the summertime. Um, and it just my mom made clothes for us, and so a lot of the other girls wore a lot of fancy, what was it, the kind of netting tulle thing. This is a very stiff kind of material, and to dances and things like that. We took dancing in 7th grade, which was to learn how to ballroom dance. And everybody went to this one place and took the dancing lessons. And then they had a dance at Christmas time and a dance in the spring. And someone asked you to go to the dance, and then you dressed up, and people wore very fancy dresses, somewhat like people wear to prom these days, but maybe not quite as revealing. And so there was more occasion to dress up. And when we went to church on Sunday, which we always did, Sunday school and church, you always dressed up, and you wore white gloves. And if you got in the car and you hadn't remembered your white gloves, then you had to go back in the house and get your white gloves so that you would be all dressed up for church. Don't see much of that anymore, though.
And then could you tell us about how you met your husband Bob and how your relationship grew with him?
Well, I met Bob when I was about 4 years old in the church nursery, but I don't remember that. I do remember that we went to Barnard grade school together, and I quite remember him from Barnard. And he was always very cute and a good athlete. And we developed to be friends over the years in junior high and particularly in high school. And we also didn't live that far apart, so we were kind of neighbors. And by high school, he was dating somebody else for a long time, from 7th grade on through college. And but he would come over to my house and play ping pong, and he'd come over to my house and eat brownies and say, well, these are good, but they're not as good as my mother's, and tease me. Then he went to Harvard and I went to Stanford. And then we both graduated, and we had seen each other as friends over the years. And he went to law school, and he called me after after his first year of law school, and he was coming home in the summer, and he asked me out, and we started dating a little bit. And then that summer, and then the next year, so we wrote letters to each other all that year. And then I had a chance to go back to Italy with a program that Stanford was sponsoring. I had gone there as a junior while I was at Stanford and loved it. And they wanted me to go and live in the dorm and help out as kind of a graduate student type thing. And I told Bob I called him on the phone, said I was thinking about going to Italy for a couple of years, maybe. And he blurted out a proposal, and we ended up getting married about a month later. And I moved back to DC, and he finished his last year of law school. And we lived there during that time. We had a very, very interesting time in Washington. But that's how I met and married Bob, and now we have been married for 56 years, I think, if I'm doing the math right. Long time.
So I have a question actually. So you mentioned that you went to Italy, is that correct?
Yes.
So how was Italy during the time period while you went? Maybe you could tell us, the year that you went and what you saw and how you would describe it.
That's a very good question. I went in 1960, and this was a Stanford program that they had just started in Italy. They'd had a similar program in Germany. And I had studied a lot of Spanish for years. Starting in 8th grade, I had Spanish every year, and even into college. And it's pretty similar to Italian, but they didn't have a great program for teaching Italian. But they decided when they started this Italy program, which was 2 quarters, so it was 6 months in Italy, and they took a couple of professors and their families over, and then they had a couple of Italian professors, and we lived all together in this one beautiful villa. It was a great experience because at that time there were no co-ed dorms, But here I was living in a co-ed dorm with 40 guys and 40 gals, and we had breakfast and dinner together, and we just had great relationships and friendships that we developed in the way that people do now, living in dorms. But at that time, you would never think in the college of having a co-ed dorm. But I think the thing that has interested me about my perspective on Italy, I was there in 1960, and there weren't a lot of ruins around, but there were still evidence of the war. But that was, early in my life, and I didn't have the perspective that it was only 15 years since the end of the war, and how close that is now when you think about the end of the World War II in 1945, and how the country was still suffering from that. And the best experience I had was I stayed in an orphanage over the month that we had for the break, and everyone else went traveling except my boyfriend and I stayed there, and we helped out at this orphanage, and we really, really learned the language at that point. But the people who ran this orphanage were a couple of missionaries, a man and his wife, and he had gone through southern Italy, and he had seen all of these families where they just could not take care of the children. They were so poor and they were so ravaged by the war. And so he set up this orphanage, and there were a lot of the kids were not really orphans, but their families sent them up there. And we had, we just had this very light soup, kind of gruel every day for dinner, and we're eating there, and they had so little money. But when you think, that really was a sense of how close to the end of the war we were. And there was one famous bridge in Italy where there are 4 statues on the corners, and they had rebuilt the bridge. They had put the statues back together, except they were statues of the seasons. And spring had lost her head, and they put out these signs all over the world. Have you seen this woman with the head of spring from this famous statue? And it was gone when I was there, but years later I read in the paper that they had dredged the Arno, the river there, and they had found the head of spring, which made me very, very happy. But that was, a war damage that was still evident at that time. And Italy was, just things like bathrooms and so on were so poor, plumbing so poor in comparison to anything that we have and that they have now, having gone back many, many, many times. But it was a wonderful experience. I really learned the language, and I've kept up my study of the language. In fact, I'm still studying the language and speaking the language. So I encourage you to learn a language well, because it makes life a lot of fun.
I agree. And I have another question for you. So, what were the fears in the and overall United States national consensus that followed the end of World War II?
The fears?
Yes.
Oh, the fears? Of course, the greatest was the nuclear threat, which was, of course, very new, and nobody knew who was going to use these nuclear bombs. Were we going to use them against Russia? Was Russia going to use them against us? And so we had to do these, like now they do active shooter drills. We had to do drills that would prepare us if a nuclear bomb hit, and they were called duck and cover. This is hilarious when you think about it, because you had to jump under your desk, and you had to cover your head like this. So we would do the jump and cover. Well, of course, that would never protect you from a nuclear bomb if it hit your city. But and people were building shelters, families were building bomb shelters in their homes and that sort of thing. And so that was a big fear. One of the other big fears in this was an epidemic fear, was the fear of polio. And when we were kids, your parents did not want you to go out in the summer. That's when it seemed the most prevalent. And so you didn't go to swimming pools and places like that where there would be a lot of people. And it was, just a tremendous time of fear, especially for parents, and kids were just playing around and not thinking as much as the parents about it. But as it happened, Bob Scott, whom I later married and was friends of at that time, contracted polio at age 14, along with other people that I knew, but Bob was the one that we knew best. And he had bulbar polio, which affects the vocal, your throat. And the people who really had severe bulbar polio were in iron lungs, which are like these big tubes that people are just lying, their head is sticking out of the tube, and that's how they live the rest of their life, and the tube breathes for them. Well, fortunately, he did not have bulbar polio so bad that he had to be in an iron lung, but it was very scary, and he still has a paralyzed vocal cord. And so the other vocal cord has to do the extra work, and sometimes his voice gives out. But he was very fortunate because another friend that was on the same baseball team and got polio was very badly crippled. And he too was another excellent athlete. And I saw him later in Tulsa, and he had the two crutches, the metal crutches that you have, and he was struggling to get across the street. And I thought, you know, this was a guy who was a terrific athlete, and now he can barely get across the street. So that was a huge scare. The year after Bob had polio, they developed the polio vaccine. And so he missed it by a year, but that was a tremendous thing for everyone when that was developed. It was really great.
So now I have a question. How would you say that the way the diseases were handled back then, how does that differ from how they're dealt with now? Especially since, you know, right now we are in the midst of the COVID-19 outbreak with this pandemic and all of that going on. So how would you say that the diseases were dealt with differently?
Well, I think it's a good comparison, Gregorio, because they developed this vaccine in less than a year. It took years to develop the polio vaccine. People were working on that for years, and there were all kinds of money raising and consciousness raising things going on. Bob's mother used to work for the March of Dimes, which would go around and collect dimes from people that to raise money to fight and for research for polio. And so that took a long time. And the first vaccine that they put out, everyone was so excited, and then there was a bad batch, and a lot of kids got polio. And so, you know, we see how things can go wrong. They haven't gone wrong this time, so we've been very, very, you know, very fortunate. But when you think that penicillin, which deals with so many terrible things that we fight now in terms of health issues, was only invented about the time I was born. You know, it was, I think, invented sometime in the 40s. And so a lot of things that we take for granted can be dealt with, ear infections, et cetera, et cetera. So many things that penicillin, and especially things like STD types of maladies, you know, can be dealt with now that used to kill men through the ages. So it's amazing to me when you hear about the kinds of operations and so on that we can do now, like open heart surgery and those types of things that people weren't doing those then. Those are all, you know, those are all in the last few years, it seems like. So, I mean, the ability to have things like MRIs and CAT scans where we can see what's going on inside the body. I didn't live in the era of leeches, but it was not that, doesn't seem like it was that far beyond leeches in terms of things that they could, you know, figure out what was going on in your body. They could tell if you had a pain right here, it might be appendicitis, but, you know, really being able to look inside the body and see what was going on. That's an amazing thing that we have now.
Yeah, I totally agree. So kind of take a little maybe step back, but back to your kind of home life in Tulsa and beyond. You told us earlier in the pre-interview that your father worked in the oil fields and your mother was a housewife, or as they called it back then, kind of like maybe a homemaker. Could you explain to us the expected role of women that you experienced as you were growing up and how that affected your choice of career?
Absolutely. My dad worked in various aspects of the oil construction and so on. Both my parents had a college degree, and that was very fortunate. My dad grew up in a little town in Oklahoma. I mean, little, I mean like 160 people. I just hated to go to Orlando because there was nothing to do there. It's called Orlando, not to be confused with Orlando, Florida in any way. But he was very fortunate because his dad believed in education and said, I'll send you the first 2 years and you can pay me back for the next 2. And he got an electrical engineering degree. And that really was the difference in his life from this little bitty town. If he'd had no education, I think it would have been a very different life. But he also met lots of great people in college, and they started businesses and they got together to do businesses and so on. And one of the things that I was really proud of was that one of the businesses that they formed, the first business that they had was to put in the rural electrification lines. They had finally voted to have electricity going to the farms, but nobody was doing that, and they did that. They put those lines in and so on. But my dad worked, and my mom, who had a master's degree actually in speech, she taught speech before she got married, never worked after she got married outside the home. It was just not expected that women would work, and the male person in the family worked and took care of everything. And if the woman worked, it was kind of like saying, well, you're not doing the best job, providing for the family. And one person who worked could provide for the family in those days if they had a good job. My mom loved being a homemaker. She was a great cook. She did a lot of volunteer work and so on. She never felt like she wanted to do anything different. And so that was the expectation. I have a group of friends from high school that we made great friends then, but we've become even better friends as we've grown up. So about 20 years ago, we started getting together. People moved all over the country from Tulsa. Only one person had remained in Tulsa. And so we've gotten together every year for about the last 20 years and are now just Zooming together. But we've laughed about the fact that the idea of education for a woman was to get some kind of education. So, quote, you would have something to fall back on. And the reason you would have to fall back was because you failed to get married and have children, which is what you were expected to do. But if you had to fall back on something, then you could be a teacher, you could be a nurse, or you could be a secretary. So those were the things that you could educate yourself to do. I have a friend who's a fantastic artist, but of course her family said, you've got to study secretarial school because you'll then have that to fall back on. I studied speech pathology and audiology, and I thought that would be a good thing to fall back on if I ever needed to work, but I was not really assuming that I would have a career. As it turned out, I went back to school, got my master's in business administration, and had a great job for 39 years. And was a wonderful, wonderful experience in a wonderful, wonderful company. I was very fortunate because I started that job in 1980. And when you look back at the role of women in this, it was really in the 60s and 70s that the doors really opened for women to have jobs in a lot of different types of businesses and so on. So I was just really at the very start of that ability to have this wonderful career that I had, which I started after my kids were 7, 9, and 11 when I started working. So I'd had a lot of time at home with them when they were really small, and I wouldn't give anything, for that experience. And so it was assumed that the wife would not work. I remember that one of my mother's friends, was a friend of the family, and when her kids were grown, she really, really wanted to get a job. She just wanted to get out of the house. She was a person who spent all day cleaning house. I remember her saying that she took all the sheets off the bed and put them on again. And I thought, why would anyone do that? Well, it was because she had nothing else to do. So she was filling up time. And so, but then, it was, the friends thought that was just, well, Joe must not be making enough money. Joe, why would she want to go to work? I mean, I think about that now and it just amazes me because now it's almost absolutely necessary given what's happened with salaries and so on and pay that hasn't gone up over the last 20 years, that it's necessary for women to work to bring in enough to have kind of a living standard for a family, and it's assumed. And women think about their careers and plan their careers, and and don't get married for a while because they want to have this career and so on and get established. So that has changed enormously since the time when I was growing up.
So kind of speaking off that a little bit, and you're talking about how you got you were studying speech and something like that. I want to talk to you about your languages, your known languages. I know you know. Yeah, you might not say fluently, but to me they sound fluent enough. You are proficient in ASL and Italian. Can you talk a little bit about how you learned both of those, especially ASL, because I think that's super interesting.
Well, when Bob and I got married, I mentioned we decided to get married. He kind of popped the question, much to his surprise, and then we followed up on it and decided, yeah, let's get married. And in fact, we got married after most people our age, and we were only 24. We had just turned 24. Both of us had our birthdays about 5 days apart, right at the time that we got married. But I remember someone saying to me a guy saying to me, when I was 23, how come you never married? Which I thought was hilarious because I assumed that I wasn't too old to get married at age 23. Now people get married at 23. People say, what are you doing getting married so young? But when we got married, Bob had another year of law school. So we drove back to DC, and I immediately started looking for a job because we needed to eat and we needed to pay for our apartment. And I thought, well, I'll find a secretarial job. And I looked in several places. And then I went out to Gallaudet College, which is the only college now, university for the deaf in the world, exclusively for the deaf. In fact, there is a new program called Deaf U, which is about Gallaudet. And if you want to see people signing, watch that because it's phenomenal, the signing that they do and how they're living a normal life as deaf people signing. But I went out to Gallaudet and they said, oh, well, this job is already filled. But I left my resume there, and then I got a call the next day from somebody who wanted me to work on him. He was a professor there, but he had this publication called the Annals for the Deaf. And so I worked for him for a year. It was a really, secretarial clerking kind of job. And but during that time, I was surrounded by people who were signing because, I was on the Gallaudet campus. And actually our office was in the dorm. So you saw the kids all the time. And I thought, I really want to sign. I can't stand being in a country where I don't know the language. And so I asked if I could take my lunch hour and go up and take signing lessons. So I took an hour every day up to the professor who taught new people coming into the university, teachers and so on that didn't know how to sign. So I learned how to sign pretty well. So then the next year they offered me a job as a teacher there in their communication department, which was really fun because the students then helped me learn more about signing and so on, would correct me if I said something dirty that I didn't mean to say or whatever. And I had a lot of great students, some who went on to become members of the National Theater of the Deaf, who were so, so expressive and such neat people. So then when we moved to Wisconsin, after we were in the Army for 3 years, I say we, but Bob was in the Army and I was supporting him. And when we moved here, I called the what is now called Here Wisconsin, that works with deaf people and deaf families, children and deaf families and so on. And so I ended up doing some interpreting for several years while our children were small. And I would interpret for people who were taking, I had a kind of regular job interpreting for a professor at UWM who would have meetings with his peers, his colleagues. And they needed someone to interpret what was being said in the meeting to him. And I did lots of different jobs interpreting, and it was a lot of fun. I wasn't the best, but I could do it pretty well. So that was a neat experience for me. I still, after I started working at Baird, I would still get calls occasionally saying, we've got somebody down here in the jail, we need to arraign them, can you come down and interpret for them? And I would say, no, can't do it anymore. But that was good. And as they say, Italian. I think I could speak Spanish. I understand, if we're listening to something when people were talking in Spanish, I understand, most of it. But I've kind of confused it a lot with Italian because they're very similar. So I'd have to immerse myself in Spanish, and then I would get going in that, I think. But it's fun to know different languages. As I'm sure, Gregorio, do you know other languages?
I do. I also speak Spanish.
Okay. We'll have to get together and I'll see if we can understand each other. You could, actually, when we were on this ship going to Italy with a bunch of people who were also going to France for the Stanford program that was starting there. And so we decided with the Italian that I had picked up in this course they gave right before we went, and the Spanish that I knew, that we would fool this guy that I was Spanish or Italian, and he actually began to believe it because I was speaking this combination of Spanish and Italian to him, and my friend was saying she's from wherever, and then finally we had to, and he was totally buying it. So they're close enough, but it's still you still have to separate them up. But so sometime we'll have to speak Spanish together.
That'd be great.
So Nona, or sorry, Mrs. Scott, Judith. So you kind of talked about how Bob went to war, or Bob was involved. Could you speak a little bit about at the time of Vietnam, what were your thoughts on the war, and what was your personal experience with people who were involved in the war, and things like that?
So we lived in Washington, and Bob was working for a law firm. I would go back and say that when we got married, the Peace Corps was a big thing, and my sister's fiance was actually in one of the very first groups that was in the Peace Corps. And so we applied to go into the Peace Corps, but at that time they didn't really have an assignment that they thought would fit for us. So nothing happened for a couple of years. And then we got a chance to go into the Peace Corps, and we were planning on going, and we actually were supposed to go into training in March. And so right after Christmas, we came home and Bob got a draft notice. So we were shocked because we had been in Tulsa, and he'd asked the service people, are you deferring people for the Peace Corps? And they said yes, but they had changed that rule. So we scrambled around for a month or so, and he ended up signing up for something called the Medical Service Corps, where he would be an officer, but he would be in for 3 years. So we ended up spending those 3 years in DC and never really leaving our apartment. He worked at the Pentagon, and then he worked downtown in a special job that was created for to work with people who had problems that evolved out of Vietnam. So we were very, very fortunate that we did not have to go to Vietnam, because that could have been obviously disastrous, and has been for many, many people that went there. We did not at that time have the information that we now have about the Vietnam War. And there were a lot of lies that were told and so on, and you didn't know what to think. But there were a lot of things that happened during that period that we lived there while he was in the Army, that shook us up terribly. One was, before we went to DC, Kennedy was killed. And of course, that was something that none of us who lived through that will ever forget. And then Martin Luther King was killed and assassinated. And that, being in DC, was a fascinating and terrifying time, because the whole city was on fire. And we lived in a building that was on the highest hill of the city. We lived right across from the National Cathedral that was still being built. And they had chosen that spot because it was the highest hill, so you would be able to see the cathedral. And our building had 8 stories, and we could go up on the top of the building, And you could just look out over the whole city and you'd see all these fires burning, and the city was just being, was just disastrous after Martin Luther King was killed, because everyone was so furious and so upset about it. And the area where I worked at Gallaudet was in a more like the central city, and a lot of that area around Gallaudet was really burned out. So that was a disastrous time. And then very soon after that, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And that, I mean, when that happened, we were driving together. We were going off to work. We usually go together, but I remember we were in the car and we heard it on the radio, and it was just like, the world is falling apart. What is happening here? This was only a few months after Martin Luther King was killed, and that Robert Kennedy was making a run for the presidency at that time with the brother of JFK, and was really this very appealing guy. And it was just so shocking at that time to live through that. The city did not go up in flames in the same way that it did with Martin Luther King, but because DC was such a predominantly African-American community, and people were so upset. So we now have very strong feelings about the Vietnam War that we didn't so much have then, because we didn't have all the information that we have now of that it was perpetrated on a lie, and also on a lot of excuses that didn't make sense at the time. We're going to go over and save the world from communism. Just crazy.
So in class, we learned that Robert Kennedy actually had a lot of ties to the United Farm Workers movement. And one of the things that I would like to ask you is, what is your personal experience, if any, with the boycott of table grapes, or the Delano grape boycott?
Well, I remember, or I guess, maybe you learned things since then about Kennedy going out and being so close to Chavez, and how he supported them. And I don't remember personally being, taking part in it or being affected at the time. Now, there are a lot of historical things that happen while you're trying to take care of 3 small children. Our 3 children were under the age of 4 at one time. And then a month later, our oldest one turned 4. So they were 4, 2, and 0. And I had gone, when I lived in Washington, D.C., I went over to Catholic University and started taking Italian classes, because I really missed the Italian. I wanted to get back into Italian. And I ended up having enough credits that I could get a master's degree. So after we moved here, after Bob got out of the Army, I was working on my thesis, and also having to come back to DC when Jennifer was a baby and take a comprehensive exam. So I had 2 little babies, and I wrote a thesis and got a master's degree. So a lot of things happen while you're basically trying to put one foot in front of the other and take care of a family. So things that you later, I love reading about history. I love reading biographies, which often are a great way to learn about history during a period. And also watching things like Ken Burns, Vietnam series and so on. You get a much better sense than maybe at the time when you were just so absorbed with doing whatever you were doing, especially after I went to work. I had a very demanding job after a while, not at first, but after a while, and traveled a lot and just had a great career. But a lot of other things that happened didn't impinge on you as much as they probably should have.
All right, Nona, well, it was fabulous to talk to you, as always. I hope you've had a wonderful Mother's Day. And if there's anything you think we should ask you, or anything you think we should we missed, please let us.
Well, there's a lot of time to cover in the 50s and the 60s. I guess I would say, when you read about the 60s, the time of the 60s, it's not the 60s that we experienced. And I think we were just a little ahead of that group that was at Woodstock, that was free love, that was into all the, the music and everything, because I had gotten married. I was looking for a job. I was working. I was going back to school. And so you're kind of doing your own thing. And so we missed a lot of the what I think people think of as, as the 60s. But we ended up okay. No, I thank you for your time and your interest. There was a lot of things that we could talk about that maybe on another occasion we can.
Yeah. Funny, just little anecdote that you reminded me of is Mr. Parsons has been teaching this class for a little bit, and he said a lot of parents had a very visceral reaction when he started teaching this class, that their kid was taking a history course about a time period that they lived in, because there's not really many, like, you think of history as, before your time, but Mr. Parsons was teaching the history that the kids' parents have lived through. So yeah.
This is true, because you really have to have some kind of a perspective when I think about all that's happened in our life and in our lifetime, and then how really close we are to, say, the Civil War. That seems like such ancient history, but it really isn't that long. And then all the problems after the Civil War that we're still dealing with, that we're still really dealing with in this country. So and how really short the life is of our country in general. It's not very, history in the whole sweep of history, it's not a very long time to have a democracy. So I hope we can hang on to it. But well, I hope you guys have a good rest of the semester and a wonderful summer. And we will, and I'm sure this will go into the archives and we'll get lots of likes or whatever. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you, Nona. It was a pleasure talking to you, and learning a bit more about your life.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I also
you for
really
your time.
appreciate it.
Well, it's very nice to meet you both. Bye, Sam.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you.
Bye, Gregorio. Ciao.
Thank you.